in the course of public discourse are offensive, obnoxious, are hurtful. The question before this panel is, should they be criminalized?
No, but my question to you is, do you regret anything you've said about Muslims?
I regret many things I've said on many subjects over the years. I will say, here's the difference. Naseem Mithwani, who I like a lot. I've run into Naseem every couple of years, and I like her enormously. I like Muniz. I quite like Khurram Marwan, who was the third of those Muslims who attempted to criminalize my writing. But I think there is a difference in this. I'm willing to debate you. I'm willing to debate Naseem. I'm not willing to go along with the big shut-up. I
appreciate you say that, because we talk about thresholds, and Mr. Robson was raising great concern about any threshold to hate speech. We, of course, for decades, since 1970, have had a very high threshold with respect to hate speech in the criminal code. So to all three panelists, give me one example over the last 50 years where the criminal code has been improperly applied to hate speech. One single example, 50 years.
What do you mean by improperly?
Has it been, a court has dismissed it and said that this should never have been brought. You raise procedural concerns about Section 13. You lambasted it for your 10 minutes. Give me one example of impropriety with respect to the criminal code and hate speech over the last 50 years.
Well, I've read the Taylor and Watcott decisions carefully, and nothing that people have complained about before this committee come anything close to the narrow definitions of the Supreme Court of Canada in
right,
both
the narrow
those
definitions
cases.
of the Supreme Court of Canada.
Yes.
So my concern is an enforcement issue. I think it should be the high threshold of the criminal code. None of you have suggested a single example over the last 50 years as to why that high threshold is a problem. So my concern is enforcement. And I encourage you to take that back and think, are there better ways we can enforce criminal hate speech? And the last thing I will say, because it's not just the end of Ramadan this week, but it's also this Thursday, the 75th anniversary of D-Day. And Ms. Shepherd, when you go on YouTube and you embrace the views of population replacement with a white nationalist, just remember who the Nazis are. Thanks very much.
Ms. Shepherd, do you want to respond at all to that?
No.
Okay. Mr. Garrison.
May I respond?
Well,
thank you very much.
Well, I appreciate it. That was I asked Ms. Shepherd, he made a statement. I asked her because she was referenced in the statement. I'm sure you'll have
a question to all the witnesses.
Oh, on the criminal code?
Yeah. And though I am not here to debate specifics, I want to say that inasmuch as laws that censor speech are fundamentally illegitimate, it is not appropriate to figure out what the best way is to do a bad thing. On the other hand, because I talked earlier about how the internet is awash in rubbish, I run a website which actually is skeptical about man-made climate change, and people are forever saying we're going to report you as fake news and get you shut down. But the other day, somebody put a comment on our blog that said, and I quote, Canada's Environment Minister, Catherine McKenna, a.k.a. Climate Barbie, in typical Nazi-like screeching manner declared, blah, blah, blah. And then at the end it said Joseph Goebbels would be proud. And of course, I deleted that comment as soon as I saw it. Because as a private matter, not a governmental matter, we are under no obligation to tolerate this kind of rubbish when it appears. And I have reproached people for using that nickname for our environment minister. I think it is disrespectful. I think it is mean-spirited. I think it is harmful to speaker and to audience alike. Man is not poisoned by what goes in his mouth, by what comes out of it. But as a private matter, we refuse to associate with these kinds of things. As a public matter, it is not your place to silence us, even if we want to say something like, the Quran does not separate church and state, and this is a serious problem in political economy.
Thank you very much. Mr. Garrison.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and I must confess I find this panel extremely challenging because I happen to live in the real world and I happen to live in this century. And so when we have members on the panel talking about and saying things like there is no gay bashing in this country, that's simply not true. And when we say that hate crimes for the most part aren't violent, unless you look at the case of transgender Canadians, when most of the hate crimes that are reported are violent. So we've had a lot of, I think, factually incorrect material. But I think for me, the question comes down to the minimizing of the impacts of hate speech. And so I'm going to talk very personally here as someone who has been the first out gay man in a lot of different positions. And I don't think any of you three understand what the result of the hate speech is for people in my position, or for transgender people, for Indigenous women in Canada. I don't think you understand at all what happens in the real world. So when I was appointed to the police board some time ago, we had to have a discussion with the police chief about whether I had to have more police protection, right? Because there were people online, at that time it was early, but online, who were inciting violence against me as an out gay man. When I was elected to city council in a very progressive community, we had to have discussions about what would happen at the public meetings because of things that were being said and posted about the fact that someone, my favorite, someone should do something about me. I took that very seriously, and certainly my partner took that very seriously. And when I was elected to Parliament, I received death threats, multiple death threats. And I had to meet with the police chief and have a discussion about what was an appropriate response to those threats. Some were very explicit, some were less explicit. And my conversation with the police chief was, if I'm a member of Parliament and somebody who's been an out public figure by that time for almost 2 decades, and this is being directed at me, what is being directed at other members of my community? What are they facing on a daily basis? And if we don't do something about that, then we are in fact encouraging it to go on. And so the police chief that I worked with, very progressive, saying, surely you're not talking about arrests. And I said, of course I'm not talking about arrests. But I'm talking about some door knocking with those who've directly threatened me, saying that this behavior is unacceptable and it needs to stop. And there were a number of cases where the police did agree to do that. And in my case, I was not worried on a daily basis that any of those particular individuals which we'd identified would come after me, although it was possible. I was, as I said, worried about the impact of that kind of speech and that kind of behavior on other members of my community. I would have to say that for me, when I first arrived in Parliament, there was an official statement done by a party, which I won't name today, suggesting that I was a friend of pedophiles. Now, you might say that's free speech. My argument with the Speaker was that impaired my ability to do my job as a member of Parliament. So by identifying me with a quite reviled and justly so group in society, people were affecting my ability to act as a member of Parliament. Unfortunately, the Speaker at that time never ruled on that question. And I would have to say that perhaps that was a statement by an outlier, because that didn't happen again in Parliament. But it was necessary for me to speak up at that point to prevent the continuation of that kind of speech. So when you, and all three of you have done this, when you minimize the impact of hate speech on people's daily lives, I think you miss the entire point of these hearings. The entire point of these hearings is not about criminalizing speech. It's about deciding where, in a modern society where social media have, in fact, become the public square, where do we draw the line? And so the old cliche, we all know that there are limits on speech. You can't shout fire in a crowded theater. So the problem is defining where that crowded theater is these days. And quite often that crowded theater is online and is the internet. And so what this committee is trying to do in these hearings is figure out where to draw that line. What's the appropriate place? It's not trying to ban speech or ideas. And I would have to say, because one of you did say it, that we need to debate these ideas so we know what's wrong with them. And I would submit we already know what's wrong with racism. We already know what's wrong with homophobia. We already know what's wrong with misogyny. What we're trying to do is to make sure that those ideas have less impact on real lives of people in our society. And so I guess I reject almost everything that you said today, because the context you place it in is academic, is historical, and has no relation at all to what happens in the real world. And so I believe, Mr. Chair, that we're out of time as a committee, so I will leave my comments there.
Well, there was no repeating ask any questions, Mr. Steyn, and that's a member's prerogative to just make a statement and not ask questions. Mr. Ehassi is next. Mr. Ehassi?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Now, if I could start off with Ms. Shepherd. Ms. Shepherd, on March 22nd, you were published in Maclean's. There is a quote attributed to you, and I suspect you had said, appearing on a neo-Nazi podcast and reciting slogans associated with Nazism is distasteful, destructive to healthy race relations, and completely deserving of harsh criticism. Do you still stand by that?
Absolutely, yeah, that was March 22nd, 2018.
Okay. Would you agree that racism can be destructive to healthy race relations and deserves to be criticized and condemned?
Sure.
And you would say the same thing about sexism and homophobia. They're destructive to the public order and they should be condemned?
Well, then I have to go into how are you defining those things, but as a general, just as the question as it is, yes.
Yes, so you agree that all of these isms can be troubling to the public order?
Sure.
And should be condemned?
Sure.
Okay, so do you think that public figures, Canadian public figures, have a responsibility to condemn hate speech?
No.
No, you think it's perfectly fine. So you agree it's destructive, but you don't think it should be condemned?
I don't think people have a responsibility to condemn.
You don't think people have a responsibility to condemn? But I think you said here they are deserving of harsh criticism.
That doesn't mean people have to be assigned a responsibility.
No, but you do agree that these terrible things are deserving of harsh criticism.
Sure.
So why do you think that our public figures should be spared?
I guess I just don't want to go into a situation where it's you have to speak out on every single little thing that happened, and if you're silent, you are a culprit.
Things. Do you think the big things they should criticize?
Well, then we have to go into what's the difference between a little thing and a big thing.
Sure,
We can see how these things go in circles,
agree,
right?
With the notion that they should be condemned.
Sorry?
But the big things, as you put it, you think should be condemned.
Yes, but then the problem is the operational definitions.
Okay. Thank you for that. Now, Mr. Steyn, I think you essentially admitted to the fact that you have said obnoxious and hurtful things in the past. Would you...
I've been in this business a long time, and I don't think you'd find anyone, including most of my editors, who would find me anything other than obnoxious, unpleasant, and hurtful.
Okay, so would you agree that the article you wrote in Maclean's The Future Belongs to Islam, where you stated it's the end of the world as we've known it. Would you agree that's alarmist, that's obnoxious?
Well, actually, that's a bit of the problem with it. This is what and with respect to Mr. Garrison thinking this is all academic and mumbo-jumbo, that's what the my learned friends would call res judicata. The thing has been adjudicated. I was taken to three...
Would you say that that's obnoxious and alarmist?
I was taken to three human rights tribunals and I won, sir. I won. If you want to take me to court for a fourth time, I won. No, that's been adjudicated and I'm in the clear. I beat the rap. In British Columbia at the Federal Commission.
I don't think you were adjudicated as to whether you were obnoxious or you were hurtful.
No, as I said, it's so stipulated, sir.
No, but that's not what you were adjudicated.
That is
correct.
That is.
Would you agree with that?
My obnoxious. I sat in the Robson Street Courthouse in Vancouver and heard an expert witness flown in from Philadelphia discourse on the quality of my jokes, some of which are indeed obnoxious, hurtful. I think that is better left to an article in the Literary Review of Canada,
Absolutely.
sir.
Now, you also objected to Chris Cuomo, the CNN commentator, saying, the real problem is white supremacists in America. They're the real monsters. You took issue with that. Why did you take issue with that statement?
Well, actually, I'm not sure I have any particular... Well, here's the thing. My QC in that case, Julian Porter, also the Prime Minister's QC, he took the position...
Could we stick to Mr. Cuomo's...
I'm answering your question. He took the principled position that we had nothing to defend under Canadian law. I am not here, sir, to justify to you words I have used on TV in the United States, radio in Australia. And I do not intend to do it. The words I chose are the words I chose, and you are free to interpret them as you so wish.
Question. Why did you condemn
No,
Mr. Cuomo?
you're doing what is perhaps the most repugnant aspect of this. No, you're doing what is the most repulsive aspect of this committee, which is you're trying to force people to deny certain things they said 5, 10, 15 years ago.
I'm asking questions. That's my job here.
As if there is only one correct position on Islam, on immigration, on climate change, on transgender bathrooms, on same-sex marriage. We cannot keep going on saying this is the correct line, and if you don't, and you're not willing to sign on to that, you're a hater.
That I completely agree with Mr. Garrison. Well, this isn't an abstract exercise. I'm just asking you simple questions.
Well, I'll tell you something with respect to that, too. I'm not going to bandy death threats with Mr. Garrison. I take it he's had them. I appeared on stage